Major Herbert Rose Armstrong, born 13th May 1869 at Plymouth in Devon, had been a practising solicitor in Hay-on-Wye in Herefordshire for a number of years, having been a junior partner in the firm Cheese and Armstrong, taking over the practice when the senior partner and his wife died within a day of each other in 1914. In 1921, a dispute arose with Hay's other solicitor, Oswald Norman Martin, regarding the sale of an estate. The sale was slow, and Martin wanted the issue closed, especially as Armstrong held £500 from his client. On 20th September 1921, Martin received an unexpected gift of chocolates from Armstrong, which were delivered to his house. Neither Martin nor his wife Constance were particularly keen on sweets of any kind, so had one and put the rest away. They were then brought out at a dinner party on 8th October. Only one of their guests, Dorothy Martin, his brother Gilbert's wife, had one, but the following day was violently ill. Meanwhile, with the transaction stalling, Martin's client decided to withdraw from the deal, so he informed Armstrong, who suggested the two meet to thrash it out. Armstrong invited Martin to his home, Mayfield, at nearby Cussup, on 26 October 1921, for afternoon tea. Armstrong poured Martin some tea, then handed him a buttered scone, saying, "Excuse my fingers." At around 6:30 that evening, Martin arrived at his home at Bredon Hills, Cussup, but an hour later began to feel unwell. That night he vomited, had stomach pains, diarrhoea, and his heart raced. When morning came, he was very sensitive towards the light, so Dr. Thomas Hinks was called the following day. Hearing the news, Armstrong offered to take on Martin's work to help him out while he was ill. However, suspicions soon rose. The local chemist was John Davies and was the father of Constance. He'd been made aware of Dorothy Martin's illness, and word got to him about Martin's sickness. He soon realised that he'd sold Armstrong several quantities of arsenic over the previous few months, but he'd claimed it was to be used as weed killer. Davis spoke to Dr. Hinks, who then took samples of Martin's vomit and urine and sent off the chocolates for testing at the Clinical Research Association in London. All tested positive for arsenic. With Armstrong being a prominent member of the community and a Freemason, police carried out their inquiries on the quiet. By the end of the year, however, they had enough evidence against him that they arrested him at his office in Broad Street. He was charged with attempted murder, but what now became suspicious was the death of his wife, Catherine Mary Armstrong, on 22nd February 1921. The couple had married in 1907 and had 3 children, Eleanor, Margaret and Pearson. She had tended to be a sickly woman, but in May 1920 she began suffering from a gastric illness, and she made out a new will on 8th July. In her previous will of 1917, she'd left everything to her 3 children, apart from £50, which her husband was to receive annually until 1933, then no more. In this new will, he was the sole beneficiary of her estate, and he was appointed as her executor. Probate was granted on 30th March 1921. It soon transpired the handwriting on the second will was Armstrong's, but his wife had signed it. following a stint in the Barnwood Hospital for Mental Disorders near Gloucester, where she was given a tiny dose of arsenic to treat her heart murmur, confusion and delusions for a few months, she was finally released into the care of her husband and a nurse on 22nd January 1921. Just a few days later, the nurse Muriel Kinsey resigned her post due to Catherine's constant threats of suicide. Another nurse, Eva Allen, took over on 27th January. In the weeks leading up to her death, she suffered attacks of vomiting, muscular spasms and stomach pains before finally dying on 22nd February, aged 47. Her cause of death was given as primarily heart disease, but also nephritis and acute gastritis. Instead of grieving his wife's death, Armstrong took a holiday abroad, then on his return proposed to Mrs. Marion Gale, whom he'd met in 1915 while stationed in Bournemouth during World War I. When arrested, Armstrong was searched, and 1/20th of an ounce of arsenic was found in his jacket pocket. More was found in his desk drawers, and his excuse for killing weeds simply didn't wash. On 2nd January 1922, Catherine's body was exhumed, with Sir Bernard Spilsbury conducting the post-mortem. 3 3/4 grains of arsenic were found in her organs, so on 19th January 1922, Armstrong was formally charged with her murder. He appeared before Magistrate W. Mortimer Bayliss, and witnesses testified to the deteriorating health of Catherine. One woman caused a bit of a stir. This was a heavily veiled lady known in the court as Mrs. X. She turned out to be Mrs. Marion Gale. Armstrong's trial for the murder of his wife and the attempted murder of Martin began on 3rd April 1922 at Hereford before Mr. Justice John Charles Darling. Sir Ernest Pollock, King's Counsel, the Attorney-General, headed up the Crown prosecution case, while Armstrong was defended by Sir Henry Curtis Bennett. There was, however, insufficient evidence that Armstrong had sent the chocolates to Martin, so that charge was dropped. Armstrong pleaded not guilty. There was some debate in the chamber whether Catherine had wanted to die or not, with Nurse Kinsey stating she was suicidal, but Nurse Allen told the court that she had asked her if she was going to die, because, she said, she had everything to live for, my children and my husband. 2 gardeners employed by the Major also testified, but neither had ever seen him use weed killer. But Mr. J did remember Armstrong showing him a patch where he had used weed killer he'd mixed himself. Dr. Hinks told the court that he'd treated both Catherine and Martin during their illnesses, and when she'd taken ill, his instinct told him she'd been poisoned, but the symptoms she showed were all consistent with natural causes. When the chemist Davies took the stand, he told the court Armstrong had signed for arsenic in the poisons register every time he purchased it, but it never occurred to him that it was an excessive amount at the time. He always bought white arsenic, but it was more usual that it was coloured with charcoal, so this was a bit of a mystery. Sergeant Worthing told the court he'd been the one to find arsenic while searching Armstrong's home, and also found a recipe for weed killer. Both he and Chief Inspector Crutchett of Scotland Yard said that Armstrong was fully cooperative throughout the searches of both his home and his office. Martin told the court about his illness and the barrage of invites to Armstrong's home for tea following his illness, which he repeatedly declined. When Dr. Spilsbury took the stand, he told the court Catherine had died of arsenic poisoning and that large quantities of it had been consumed by her in the week leading up to her death. A fatal dose had been given 24 hours before she died. He was backed up by Sir William Wilcox, the Home Office medical advisor, and John Webster, a pathological chemist for the Home Office. It was the largest amount Webster had come across in his entire career. It was also pointed out that if it was suicide, then 1, possibly 2 large doses would have been more likely than the slow, painful death she'd suffered. Armstrong's solicitor tried to convince the court that Catherine had indeed taken her own life, but before the judge had even summed up, 11 of the 12 members of the jury believed Armstrong was guilty. Judge Darling then proceeded to pass the death sentence. The attempted murder charge, he told the court, would have to wait until the next assizes. An appeal was lodged immediately, and on 11th May was heard before the Lord Chief Justice, Sir Gordon Hewart, and Justices Sir Horace Avery and Sir Montague Shearman. The judges threw out the appeal, and Armstrong was hanged on 31st May 1922 at Gloucester Prison. He died protesting his innocence.